Hello and welcome to episode 201 of the Clean Energy Show. I'm Brian Stockton.
And I'm James Whittingham. This week on the program, I try to take a reasonable look at the future of nuclear power in North America. Maybe micro-reactors in every fridge is the way to go.
The New York Times has written a feature article about comedians taking on climate change with humor. And if these opening jokes were funnier, they would have included us as well.
Microsoft says ChatGPT alone could require the power of several full-size nuclear reactors. I'm not worried, though, as I'm sure ChatGPT will figure out a way to solve this problem on its own.
This week, we take a look at carbon emissions in the airline industry. Is it possible to fly guilt-free? I just wish it was possible for Air Canada to serve chicken that didn't taste like rubber.
All that and more in this edition of the Clean Energy Show. Also on the show this week, New Jersey offers $50,000 for electric school buses as backup power for schools. Battery storage is taking off in 2024. Bigger offshore wind turbines are being shelved in the United States this year. The city of Chicago is suing all 6 oil and gas corporations for deceiving Chicago consumers about the climate dangers associated with their products. Brian, as we taped the show last week, my hapless son in town from university for a week off was getting his oil changed in his old combustion vehicle, and he was trying to get a hold of me, but I was doing the podcast, and they were screwing him at the oil change place. He said he brought his own high-mileage oil because his car is from 2002. It's like a Honda Civic. So he bought high-mileage oil at the Canadian Tire store, took it to the oil change place, Mr. Lube, and they did things that he didn't want them to do. They lubricated things. He said, I just want the oil change. And they put in washer fluid and charged him $3 for putting a few splashes of that. He said, no, I don't want anything.
That used to be free, the top-ups of the washer fluid, but not anymore.
Yeah, along with the coffee. But that's just stupid. The whole thing is stupid. Do you realize that? Do you realize how stupid this is? It's worth getting an EV just for that.
Yeah, anytime anyone talks to me about something like an oil change, I feel like my eyes just glaze over, and I just like, it's like talking to someone from the previous century.
And then, if that wasn't bad enough, he went and filled up his gas tank, and the nozzle was leaking. A bit of a safety hazard. And it got all over him, and of course, it stunk on him the whole day. And this is carcinogenic. It's archaic. This old system is archaic. And there's a better way, Brian. There's a better way. You and I both have EVs, 5 between us at the moment.
Yeah, that's too many, but yes.
It's a little ridiculous, but we'll whittle that down soon. And also, I had an update on my family tree. You remember I was doing my family tree, and I got back to something like 1,200. Well, for some reason, I merged one of my relatives into another family tree that was a duplicate, and that family tree took off ostensibly to 400 BC. But it's BS, because somewhere in the line was Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene having a baby. So somebody screwed with it. Spent a lot of time screwing with it. And but mine does go back to one dude who came over on the Mayflower. His name was Richard Warren. And this has been extensively researched because, you know, all the Mayflower people have been, and their lines have been researched. Well, for a second, I thought that was special because I was in turn related to Taylor Swift, who's a cousin of mine, distant cousin. Sure. But it means nothing because that one guy had 17 million descendants. Sure. He had 5 kids who all had 5 kids. And from the early 1600s, that really takes off. But again, it had me thinking about my descendants. I mean, one day somebody's going to look back at me and they're all going to have that information now. They're going to have audio recordings of me and pictures, and my most inner thoughts are going to be available if they so desire to check them out. And they're going to have to know that I gave an F about the planet that they've inhabited. You know, that many generations, hopefully the climate crisis is over because that was 400 years ago, but we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about New Jersey this week, and that's the home of the Stockton family in North America is New Jersey. Richard the Signer Stockton, signer of the Declaration of
Yeah, I never
Independence.
liked him. I never cared for him. Very shifty. The Stocktons, the long line of Stocktons are shifty.
It's totally shifty.
So you've done your research, or somebody else did it for you?
Mostly done for me. Yeah.
Okay. But you do have a curiosity about these things. I never knew squat about any of this, and I went out to a graveyard where my great-grandfather was buried, and I noticed that you have to spend a lot of money on grave cleaners to get the moss off those things. I wanted to do something. It's in Edgeley. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's this wide open prairie, and there's this little graveyard. It's nowhere near the town of Edgeley, nowhere near anything. And it's just this peaceful little place that I think my daughter and I are going to go clean gravestones in the summer and have a picnic and bring some chairs and on a nice summer day. It's nice, close. It's not that far away.
Well, that really sounds like the setup for a horror movie, quite frankly. But and also your descendants in the future, I mean, they'll be able to clone you. That sounds like another horror movie.
Well, cloning me is a horror. They could do better. How are you doing?
I'm good. So I just got back from Toronto. I had a very quick trip to Toronto, and I wanted to talk about that. I have some guilt about all the flying that I'm doing. So, we're sort of going to cover that. But a quick shout out to our friend Barry. Barry's a cinematographer, and he and I worked on a film 30 years ago, a short film called The Weight of the World at the Canadian Film Centre. We were talking about Norman Jewison a couple of weeks ago. Norman Jewison was the founder of the Canadian Film Centre, our advanced film school here in Canada. And 30 years ago, I got to go there as a director resident, and Barry was my cinematographer, and we were the two guys from Saskatchewan out there in Toronto at the Film Centre. And we got to make this short film called The Weight of the World. And so I was out there just now doing a 4K restoration of this old short film. It was shot on 16 millimeter, and we went to Frame Discrete in Toronto. Shout out to them. They're this amazing place that does these new digital transfers of old, 16 and 35 millimeter film. And it just looks amazing. It's if you shot something on film back in the day, and you can scan it and revitalize it, it just looks great. So I had a ton of fun with Barry. Barry has a farm north of Toronto that's powered, heated and cooled with geothermal, which is excellent. And he's working on getting solar panels for it. They're already all on electricity, but he doesn't have the solar panels, so he's looking at doing that and maybe adding some wind power.
How do you get geothermal before you get solar panels? And I have other questions. Why does a cinematographer have a farm? Answer my questions, please.
I cannot answer that question, but that Barry flies around a lot. Speaking of flying and guilt about flying, but that's kind of his home base, is a farm north of Toronto. But he does a lot of flying. So yeah, we talked a lot about on the podcast. There was a period of about 6 years, partly because of the pandemic, where I never did any flying, and I was super proud of myself for not any of those carbon emissions. But now in the last year, I've done a ton of flying. And so I've had to kind of wrap my brain around that. Should I feel guilty about all this flying? So I listened to a podcast from The Guardian. This is on their Science Weekly podcast. This was around January 16th. This episode came out. It was called, "Is Guilt-Free Flying on the Horizon?" The short answer is yes and no. I mean, everyone is working on solutions, of course, for how to fly with fewer carbon emissions. So look up the podcast. I didn't pull any clips, but I made some notes, and I just want to talk about this podcast for a second. But look it up if you're interested in this. They had a guy on who was, kind of an expert in these things, and he's currently flying electric aircraft, which we know from the show is really, at this moment, it's just short haul, often for training. Very, very small aircraft are electric, but it's, this is kind of where we're at for flying. It is going to take quite a while. This is going to be one of the harder things to solve in terms of carbon emissions and climate change. Right now, 2.5% to 7% of the worldwide carbon emissions are from flying. They don't know the exact figure, but sometime, 2.5% to 7%.
And they're anticipating a lot more people are going to fly. It's the same reason a lot more people are driving. There's more people in the world going into the middle class, and why should they be restricted to their where they live? It's the
industry is expanding, for better or for worse. So there's, different ways to tackle this that they talked about in this podcast. Green hydrogen is currently one of the solutions, so it is possible to power an aircraft with green hydrogen. But right now, it's kind of looking like very similar to just battery electric airplanes, that the hydrogen would work best for kind of shorter distances. And, we think that we're going to have maybe battery electric planes that, it sounds like it would be something similar. The problem is going to be those super long flights. So as it is right now, if, you've got an airplane, the problem is batteries are too heavy, right? And airplanes have to fly. So, normal jet fuel is 1/50th the weight for the same amount of energy currently for what's available for batteries. And that's why it's not currently practical. So what should we be doing? Well, we should be investing in other things other than flying, more robust rail, high-speed rail. And like they have done in France, we need to do more regulations to basically outlaw any short-haul flying, which, in France, we've talked about this on the show, that if it's something within an hour or two, you're not going to be allowed to have a flight. You're going to have to go by train. So we should be doing more of those kinds of things. They talked about contrails in the sky, and I've never fully kind of understood what the problem is, but when you see a jet flying through the air, of course, sometimes there's big clouds that form because of them, and they're basically artificial clouds. And some of those are worse than others in terms of climate change, and I don't quite understand the science from that. But basically, soot from the fuel creates ice crystals, and it sort of interacts with what's in the air to make ice crystals. And some of these are sort of worse in terms of climate change. But the expert on the show thought that this could be addressed with more precise and more accurate weather forecasting. So what he was saying was that you should be able to predict the areas of the sky that are more likely to interact and form these ice crystals and form these artificial clouds. And if we can accurately predict those, well, then we can just reroute the planes so that they don't fly through those areas. And if we can figure that out, that would actually be a massive reduction in terms of the sort of greenhouse gases that airplanes do. So, yeah, I thought this was super interesting. Of course, biofuels is another one, or e-fuels. And, you can make fuel by taking carbon out of the air. You can take the carbon out of the air to make your fuel. And this is definitely a way to do it. You could even maybe make it carbon extra neutral by taking out more carbon than you need to make the fuel. But currently it's way too expensive and difficult. And so maybe that's something on the horizon.
The contrails, I've read pieces about how much they reflect the sun. That there was a difference when the pandemic lockdown happened, and there was measurable increase. Well, one was ships. Remember, we talked about that a couple of, which was very interesting.
Yeah.
But also, from airplanes that actually deflects some of the sun.
Yeah,
so I don't know what the balance is. And certainly we need to decarbonize completely. Improving is great, but, I do foresee, though, maybe in 40 or 50 years, maybe in my kid's lifetime, where you could take a flight guilt-free, and it would also be cheap because it would be, well, for one thing, there wouldn't be any pilots involved. It would be, unfortunately, there wouldn't be any pilots involved for them, but there would be autonomous. That's very close to happening, I think. Certainly very realistic, and it's practically done by them anyway. And then you get, cheap, free solar in the batteries.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. I think guilt-free flying is on the horizon, but more for our kids probably than us, as this is definitely a longer-term thing. But, I was thinking about it, and of course it's often pointed out that it's the very wealthy that are responsible for a lot of these emissions, because it's the wealthy that fly. But a lot of it is just like people have to fly for their jobs. It's a really common thing. And I wouldn't want people to give up their careers to cut down their carbon emissions. Barry, for example, flies a lot. He does great work as a cinematographer. I don't think it makes sense for him to stop doing that just because of the emissions. I know someone who's a comedian, a stand-up comedian in Canada. We're going to talk about comedians later. It's very difficult to make a living as a comedian in Canada. You don't make a lot of money at that, but to make that money, you have to fly to do it. There's no other way. Like, Canada's a massive country. It's, in terms of area, the second largest country in the world. And all of these things, it's for me to get to Toronto, unless they built a nationwide high-speed rail, flying is the only practical way. It takes 3 days to drive to Toronto. I could drive electric, but it just takes too long. And, flying is the only practical way. And a lot of people have to do it for their jobs. And I wouldn't want them to give up their careers, just because of the carbon emissions.
What if you could take an autonomous vehicle there and it would drive you the whole way, charge the whole way, and you could just read a book and nap? And,
That's a good point, because driving yourself to Toronto takes 3 days. If you're crazy, you can do it in 2 days. But yeah, if it was an autonomous vehicle, then that you could sleep in, it's about 30 hours, 32 hours of driving. I would definitely consider that if it was autonomous. Yeah, you could do it a lot faster. Just sleep in the car.
You still have to stop for bathrooms and food, though.
Yeah.
And you might get cramped for 3 days. It's a long ways. You could look at the scenery.
Yeah. Not ideal, but, solutions on the horizon.
Maybe 20 years from now, that might be something that people do more often. They might take less flights. There might be, at that point, taxes on flights, like heavier, levies because of the carbon pollution on flights to do an alternative, and they might do that. I don't know.
Yeah, and all of that is tied to the economy, too. I mean, there's lots of things we could all do to lower our carbon footprint, but, those things all affect the economy. And, if the economy starts crashing because of that, well, then we're not really going to have enough resources to deal with these climate issues. We need a robust economy to deal with the climate.
Yeah, and Autospec Reviews did a Honda Prologue EV, and so did, 15 other people on YouTube. They did it in the San Francisco area. But I was watching that, and I had his navigation screen. And the Honda Prologue is basically the Blazer, the Chevy Blazer, with a Honda badge taped on it.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's the same damn thing, because Honda's not making their own EVs anymore at this point. They are getting the Ultium platform from Chevrolet, which has had huge problems, which was outlined in a very good investigative journalism piece on Inside EVs, was published there last week about their problems. But hopefully that doesn't come to the Honda Prologue. I don't know if it will, but they're going to make a few of them this year. So they plotted a trip to Denver, because that's where they're from San Francisco area to Denver, and it was had 10 charging stops, taking 6 hours and 22 minutes, and I thought that was a lot. And that's 155 kilowatt charging, which, by the way, I've come to the conclusion recently, Brian, that that's not enough. It's, in this day and age, we shouldn't be releasing cars that are uncompetitive with Tesla. So no wonder there's a problem with EVs. I mean, it's true that Hyundai with their 800 volt architecture can charge in 18 minutes often on the highway in perfect conditions at 350, and there's not that many fast chargers that go up to 350, but Tesla does 250. And if you're not doing that, then you're not competing with Tesla, because that's important. So unless your cars are cheaper, and they're not really that much cheaper at this moment. I plotted the same course with my Bolt, Chevy Bolt, which has the worst charging out there, maybe tied with Nissan with their Leaf, their old Leaf. But I did it on Better Route Planner. That's the software that non-Tesla people use to plan their routes and charging stops. And it said 11.5 hours and 15 stops instead of... so it was about twice as long. But it charged 3 times as fast. So I got to thinking, well, maybe 3 times peak doesn't mean 3 times as fast, right? You have to remember that. It's complicated. You have to look at how fast it charges from 10 to 80% to know what it's going to be like on the highway. So your Model Y long range was doing it in less than half the charging time of the Blazer/Prologue, what it can do. I typed it in the long range. I don't know if I got your wheels right or if I typed in all-wheel drive. I think I did, but yeah, it was 9 charges for 3 hours, which was a lot more reasonable for that length of trip. You'd have to stop that long anyway. The Hyundai Ioniq 5 long-range front-wheel drive is 4 hours of charging. Surprisingly, more than the Y. Now, I can't figure that out. Why it told me that that would be more than the Y, because that's the long range of something that charges ostensibly faster. And it wasn't the lack of 350 kilowatt chargers, because there's lots of them in that corridor between San Francisco and Denver. It selected Electrify America stations only, which have the 350 kilowatt capacity. So that it's a complicated world. It's hard to compare a car to a car. You really do have to watch these YouTube channels if you're getting serious about something and see what their tests do. They spend lots of time doing these tests. And yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. Like peak charging is important, but the overall charging is important too. Like the curve of the charging, you want it to go up and stay up for a long time before it comes down. And some of them, like mine, come down at 50%, which is not ideal.
Yeah, and still early days, and of course all this is going to improve in the next few years with more chargers available and better charging curves. But yeah, if you're going to do a lot of road trips, there's still some planning involved.
All right,
so you sent me an article from the New York Times, Climate and Comedy. The article's called "Climate Change is No Laughing Matter, or Is It?" And I thought that was interesting because we try and have an entertaining, fun time here on the Clean Energy Show.
We try. Not this week because I chipped a tooth that I can't afford to fix. So I'm not in a good mood. Yeah.
Oh, no.
My son, he came back with popcorn, and which led us to buy Cracker Jack.
Yeah.
To compare what it'd be like with peanuts, and that chipped my tooth. Yeah, it's just, yeah.
You chipped your tooth on like a hard popcorn kernel.
Something like that. It was made harder by the process of caramelizing it. Anyway.
Brutal. Well, that's going to cut back on the comedy on the show this week then.
Unless my tongue starts bleeding from the sharpness of what's left of my tooth.
But yeah, I wouldn't call what we do comedy, but we try and have fun. We try and highlight the, better news stories, because climate change, as we've discussed, last week, it's causing a lot of people anxiety, of course, climate change. So a lot of comedians have figured out that, possibly humor is the way to deal with this. And we've, I think, talked about all of these people on the show before, because I do like to highlight when somebody puts something funny out. The Juice Media from Australia, friends of ours, basically, who put out very funny, honest government ads about government policy to do with climate change. Yellow Dot Studios, which is Adam McKay. I played a clip from one of their YouTube videos, many months ago. They're putting out sort of humorous videos dealing with the climate change issue. Adam McKay, of course, made the movie Don't Look Up, it's on Netflix, and it's a comedy, I guess. Didn't make me laugh, but a comedy about
it was too dark a humor change for you, too close to home.
It was too dark, and the last one that mentioned in the article, Rolly Williams has a YouTube channel called Climate Town, which I can't remember if we've mentioned, but he makes very, very funny videos about climate issues on YouTube, and I would encourage people to look all of those up. So I like all of these channels: Yellow Dot Studios, Rolly Williams, Climate Town, the Juice Media. You found
Climate Town, but you didn't find Mr. Beast. I don't understand how that didn't come across.
I think the Mr. Beast stuff looks too clickbaity for me, and I just, the algorithm knows I don't want to see them.
The algorithm knows. It knows everything.
It knows everything.
It knows what the rabbit hole to send dumb people down and keep educating them in the wrong way.
But I did realize that, looking at these lists that I just mentioned, is I don't keep watching all of them. I've watched a few from each of these channels, but I think they maybe emphasize the negative stuff too much. I think we like to focus on the good news here on the Clean Energy Show.
And there's lots of good news, except this week.
There's lots of good news. I like to take it as a given. We all know climate change is real. We all know it's man-made. We all know it's caused by the fossil fuel industry and that they're further complicating things by pretending that it's not real and spreading misinformation. And all of those channels I mentioned, they all kind of keep going back to those things, which are very real issues that we need to deal with. But it even though they're humorous, it still makes me depressed, I think, to keep watching them. So after I've had a taste and I see what they're up to, I tend to stop watching them.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I'm surprised by that because Climate Town is very successful.
Yeah.
There's educational channels that I haven't learned about that my kids turn me on to from time to time, and I realize they've been around for 11 years and have, the hosts are retiring rich and I haven't even come across them, but they have, and they've, kids these days, they're getting educated on YouTube. That's all I have to say.
Well, Climate Town, that guy Raleigh Williams, it says here in the New York Times article, he started by doing a humorous show where he played Al Gore, and his joke was like Al Gore made an inconvenient truth a very long time ago, so he was doing a live stage show where he played Al Gore, and he was like, "I told you so, everybody! I told you so." Al Gore, can very much look back and say, "I told you so," and I thought that was super funny, and that evolved into his Climate Town YouTube channel. But yeah, I don't know. I think to me, focusing on the good news is the only way to get through this. And we've got good news every week here on the show.
Sometimes there's a struggle. There's a lot of negative news out there about EVs and the pace of renewables this week, but it is a temporary setback. We won't dwell on them because these things are still sorting themselves out.
I know, we've had a segment on the show that we did a couple of times called The Depressing Story of the Week. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and I kind of imagine we might do that every week, but, we did it a couple of times, and I'm like, okay, I don't want to do that anymore. That's too depressing.
Yeah. Well, I have the sad story of the week, too. There's always, I guess I could technically have one coming up in the podcast. It's about Arizona punishing people with solar.
Yep.
Because, why have a good thing in Arizona when you can punish it?
When you can have a bad thing.
Yeah. I don't know, Brian. I listened to David Roberts on the Dr. Volts podcast. He has that podcast that's very popular. I don't listen to a lot of episodes, but some of them, sometimes they come out and grab me. This one was on nuclear, and his guest was Jagar Shah, head of the Department of Energy Loan Programs in the U.S. government. So he's, the Department of Energy is all about nuclear. And that is, I think it used to be the Atomic Energy Commission. And I think the Georgia reactor is the first one they actually saw from start to finish. But before that, it was formed around the time of 3 Mile Island, and there hasn't been squat. Anyway, here's the thing. He's trying to be positive, and the host was very confrontational, very no holds barred. What about this? What about this? And he also said that if he tweeted the word nuclear bros would inundate him with, "What are you talking about? I don't like your tone." Yeah. There's so much heated debate on this subject that if I have it as the title of this podcast, I know that we're going to continue to get lots of negative likes on our YouTube channel. It's amazing how much negativity we have on our YouTube channel. If we talk about banning of gas cars, it's like 40% likes and the rest are hate. I don't know how they find us, the haters. Maybe they're bots. Maybe they're Russians. Maybe Putin himself is trying to keep the gas industry going, but it's amazing. Anyway, that was his guest, and there's 92 operating reactors in the United States, and no 4 of them are the same. That is one of the key points. Wow. They're all different technologies slightly.
Wow.
And that is something that has to change, but there's no active way of changing that. Now, they pointed out that the Vogtle nuclear reactors, the ones that, went way over time and way over budget by twice or more, they were adding 2 reactors to 2 reactors that already existed. So it's important to remember that wherever there's a nuclear reactor in America, there's space for 4. So you have that opportunity to put, in most cases, 2 more, and they build them in pairs because nuclear reactors, remember, are down 10% at the time, which is more than 1 month a year. In order to service them, you have to have them down. So it makes sense to have 2 reactors. So anyway, the first reactor went terribly because they had to train people. There was 13,000 people trained, 9,000 on the site of that reactor. None of them knew what they were doing, and they had to backtrack and redo things, and it went slow. The second reactor cost about 30% less. So he argued that if you built the 4th one, it would probably be about 50% of the cost of the first one and be done in about half the time. And if that were to happen, if we were to standardize, but you can't do that, there's no effort to do that because you want the free market to do whatever it wants to do. And then, the government's paying for half of this. The federal government, the NRA, is paying for half of all new nuclear reactors when it comes down to it. 30% here, 10% there, and another 10%, and all adds up to 50. And so you want to build multiple reactors. So that's one of the reasons why small modular, which he says will not be made in a factory. It's just not going to happen. They're going to be made on site. They're going to be smaller.
Yeah, well, this was the promise of small modular, nuclear reactors. The idea was that it's a standardized design. They're a bit smaller. You can perhaps make them in a factory and ship them out, and we could make lots of them quickly, but I guess maybe not so fast.
He joked that they were all snowflakes. They wanted to make snowflakes for nuclear reactors, individual, and no 2 were alike. But he said Canada got it better because we stuck with one design, and we just overhauled all of our designs and upgraded them. And apparently our workforce, because they were all the same, did a very good job. We also were more realistic about budget, so we didn't go over budget. We padded in contingencies and things like that. And so it worked out better for us. And he says the next reactor will be in Ontario as far as North America is concerned. But as far as the States are concerned, we don't know yet. So they would have to, if Brian, they standardized and went with one design for large scale nuclear reactors or small, and kept making them, the learning curve would be enough to compete with solar plus storage, perhaps. But it's just not happening. We need it to happen yesterday. It's not happening, and that has to go. He said the people who built the last reactors retired or went into other trades, and cost estimates were not smartly done. They were stupidly done, and the country lost the ability, he says, to do big things. He says, we just agreed that China would do big things, and we'll let them do it. And even with high-speed rail, they're having trouble with that in California. It's way over budget, and of course, some of it is land. People are saying, well, if you have to buy my land and you're screwed if you don't, I'm going to charge you a lot of money. But here's the thing. Microsoft alone, they are part owners or majority owners. I don't know. ChatGPT is now kind of theirs. And they need 10,000 megawatts, they figure, by 2030. Because all these companies, these tech companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, they want to be neutral, carbon neutral by 2030. They're going to need like 8+ reactors just for ChatGPT by 2030.
Yeah, well, we've talked about how things like, cryptocurrencies take a lot of electricity, and in the glorious future that you and I might not live to see, well, we'll have abundant clean energy and none of these things will be an issue. AI, of course, AI is going to take a lot of electricity. NVIDIA, who makes computer chips, the company's just taking off because they make the kind of chips that are needed for AI. But yeah, you need a lot of power to run those chips. And so it's eventually all going to work out, I believe. But in the meantime, it's going to be a power crunch.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's not even including everything else like Amazon, Meta, Google, Bitcoin, and, everybody who's decides that they're going to use AI, it's going to be very energy intensive and even uses water. Like you need to cool these places. So I got to thinking, well, we want to build some modular nuclear reactors in Canada, in our jurisdiction, in our province of 1.2 million people. Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'll get to that later. But maybe we should, if we did, maybe we should say, hey, Google, or hey, Microsoft, instead of building 2 reactors for our province, we'll build 4, and you come here and put your data center here. It's kind of cold in the wintertime, which is advantageous. It's cold out here today. It's minus 26 when I got up this morning in Celsius. Yeah, so it's only 3.5 megawatts of geothermal by 2030. Gigawatts of geothermal by 2030. It's nothing. That's they think 90 might be possible by the 2040s, but that's not a lot. So there's not a lot of geothermal potential, even that they think, even on rosiest case scenarios of decarbonizing the grid, because it is a base load power and it is something you can turn off and on pretty quickly. Yeah, so you never make 1 reactor, you make 2, and all nuclear plants have room for 4, so that's something to consider, because there's grid connections there too that should be good enough for 4 reactors when they're upgraded. And nukes, remember, are only on for 4% of the time. So yeah, so it's, at the moment, it doesn't compete with solar plus storage or the anticipated even reduction of solar plus storage, but it could perhaps do that. But I mean, is it even necessary? I don't know. We're going to talk about how some of the storage is taking off this year in 2024 later in the show. So with current nuclear plants paid off, the cost of just running the plants is 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. People think it's free. Well, 3.5 cents is kind of like what solar is. It's getting to be what solar is, or solar is getting close to that if it's not in certain regions of the world on large scale. So SMRs would be 5.5 cents. So they're more expensive because of the smaller scale. That's if they were paid off, Brian. That's not how much they'll cost,
Well, then you need things like security at nuclear power plants, and just the security costs alone that you don't necessarily need for, say, a solar farm.
And that's another reason for buying, or, putting up more than 1 reactor, is because the security costs are essentially the same. And, that's a cost that's there all the time. The global weighted average levelized cost of energy, LCOE, for solar is currently around $50 per megawatt hour. That's an hour of 1,000 watts, or 1,000,000 watts rather, for solar, and 120 for solar plus storage. That's a lot. But this guy says it'll be $200 for solar plus storage. I'm not sure if that's true, but they expect the levelized cost of electricity to drop to $30 per megawatt hour by mid-century, with some individual project costs well under $20 per megawatt hour. And I think it'll be probably $25 by the early 2030s. So that leaves storage, which is 60% of the cost in the solar plus storage scenario. And if storage halves by the early 2030s, even his cost at $85 for solar plus storage before a couple of these plants even get online. I mean, that's not really going to be terribly competitive. So most people think, most reasonable people who are not nuclear pros and who are not just plain anti-nuclear because of the dangers of it, or perceived dangers of it, they're just, it's probably going to be a niche. It's probably not going to be the general solution to climate change. It'll be there in niche settings, perhaps for data centers, perhaps for northern regions. I don't know.
Yeah, or I've heard of things like making green hydrogen, things like that. But
that's another concept, because how we talk about what are they going to do when the sun shines and the wind blows? You turn off the nuclear reactor, and that kills it right there, because that makes, when you're not making electricity, it still only lasts 40, 60 years or whatever it is. So you divide all those hours and get the unit of electricity price. You turn it off, and suddenly all of your units of electricity go up, because the major cost is building the plant. As they said, one idea that they're floating is using electrolyzers when the wholesale market is zero or negative. That's to say when the wind is, there's lots of wind, there's lots of solar, and it's there, and you've got too much of it, and you certainly don't need nuclear, so the nuclear is not going to make any money. And at that point, you make electrolyzer. You use an electrolyzer to make hydrogen, which in turn is a stored power. When the sun is not shining, you'll have extra power. Again, though, no one's doing that. No one's planning to do that. That's just a solution to a problem that's come up at coffee, that they're not actually doing this. And we know that the time is here. So either the government or governments in other parts of the world says, hey, settle on one reactor, start making them, we'll help, we'll guarantee the overages with the risks and all that, and get the costs down. And this is what we're going to do when we hit the wholesale market is low. We're going to make, we're going to support you in making hydrogen. We're going to find a market for that hydrogen. And yeah, it's very complicated. So, you know, in Canada, where we are, I think there's, we need about 4.5 gigawatts for our province here. So 2 full-scale reactors would pretty much do half of that. And that's probably why they're not accounting for more than 8% solar in 2050, which is absurd. But why mess around with small modular when you might as well just build a couple of, big nuclear reactors and invite a data center to go behind the fence of that and do that?
Yeah, well, you lose the economies of scale if you end up making them too small, because if nuclear is going to be expensive, well, then, a bigger plant makes more sense. And you mentioned that all the, the existing nuclear plants, most of them have a different design, and we're sort of headed down a path where the small modular reactors will be a different design, because every country is kind of trying their own thing.
Yeah.
And if we all got together and decided on one design, then, maybe we'd have something. But yeah, I don't know. I think here at the Clean Energy Show, like, we're on team solar, wind, and batteries, and, maybe nuclear's got a shot, but, you hear it all the time. People assume we're going to need nuclear, and, I don't think that's the case.
No, there is, I don't know if they're online or about to go online, but in China, they have a couple of small modular reactors, so they'll be the first. But you can't go to the store and buy them. You can't order them now. They're still in development, and
yeah,
and they're expensive. And the theory is that they could be made cheaper by making a lot of them, but you have to agree on one worldwide, and then you have to make a lot of them. A lot of them.
Yeah, no, there's sort of 2 existing in China, which, as I understand it, are both different. They're not the same design. They're maybe not that small. They're built on site. They're not built in a factory, which is the dream, of course, of modular. But I don't know. Nuclear's got a long way to go.
There's also microreactors, which are 1 to 15 megawatts, and some of them can actually roll around on a truck. So you could, take them to a mine. Or maybe maybe they're good for northern communities. We have northern communities in Canada that are isolated and are using diesel. They certainly could use solar. They certainly could use wind, but maybe this would be their backup, is some sort of microreactor. But again, you have to make them, and they're not making them, Brian.
Okay, so I want to talk about New Jersey, home of the Stockton family in North America. We like to talk about electric school buses here on the show, and I believe we talked a while ago about Prince Edward Island in Canada. They were putting out tenders for electric school buses, and part of the idea was when the buses aren't being used, that they could be parked at community centers or something and provide emergency power. Well, they're thinking about that in New Jersey as well. So they're offering about a $50,000 incentive for bi-directional school buses in New Jersey, and this is a pilot program. $45 million, 18 different school districts. And the idea is, this is coming from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, that the school buses could be used at the school sites for both backup power in the event of power outages at schools, as well as arbitrage from the grid. So maybe your school bus rolls up in the morning and it's got 30% charge left. Well, daytime power often costs more from your utilities, so you could run the school bus battery down to zero then and avoid some of the higher cost grid costs during the day. And then you can charge up your school bus overnight when electricity is cheaper. And of course, again, the added benefit of possibly using these buses when the power is out at school. So this is, I love these kinds of schemes. This is where we're headed in the future.
Where we live, school buses aren't parked at the school, though. They go to, I think they either go back to the yard. I often see them in front of houses. So the school bus driver, the lowly school bus driver who works several hours a day, parks them at home and watches Oprah. Or I guess you can't watch Oprah
I think that's
anymore.
the case, and then drives back to the school at the end of the day. But of course, that person could take an electric Uber back to their house. And then, so parking them at the school probably makes sense.
Oh, Brian, it's time for some law news.
If this was a death penalty state, you'd be getting the chair.
Mayor Brandon Johnson of the city of Chicago has announced that the city is suing 6 oil and gas corporations and their largest trade association for deceiving Chicago consumers about the climate dangers associated with their products. I love climate lawsuits. You want good news? A climate lawsuit's always good news. Filed in the Circuit Court of Cook County, the complaint names BP, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, Phillips 66, I didn't know they still existed, Shell, and the American Petroleum Institute as defendants. There is no justice without accountability, says the mayor. That is a good news story. Brian, I wish them well, and we'll of course update you as we go on with the show.
Well, whenever I think about Cook County, I always think about that scene from the Blues Brothers movie where the Blues Brothers have to get to the Cook County assessor's office and pay a tax bill, I think. And Steven Spielberg plays the clerk behind the counter at the Cook County assessor's office. Always fun stuff.
It is. And my kids won't watch it. It's sad.
What?
They'll watch the TikTok all day long, but I can't get them to watch classic 70s comedies. So.
Oh, my kids just watched the Blues Brothers about 2 months ago. They loved it.
Well, I'll use that as an endorsement in my next pitch, but we'll see.
Okay, so a quick update on wind turbines. And I wanted to talk about this because I've always kind of wondered. I know you love talking about the giganticness of wind turbines because they seem to get bigger every year.
Especially in China.
Especially in China. So the record now, was it 22 megawatts for the biggest one?
Yes, and that's planned.
Yeah, not existing yet.
Yeah, they skipped from 18 through 20. They've been going up by 2 megawatt increments as the nameplate power output of these things. And they skipped that.
But, I've looked at videos, which we've talked about on the show, of how these wind turbines are made and these very specific super large factories have to be built. And so it was always a bit odd to me that they kept getting bigger because you always think, well, at a certain point, doesn't it just make it too difficult to make them that big?
It does. But the wind blows stronger the higher you are, even on the ocean. And
so if they're taller,
you get more of a base load. You may get more of a constant flow.
Yeah, so this story is from Electrek, and it says GE scraps plans to make giant 18 megawatt offshore wind turbines. So the company is GE Vernova, and they were planning to go up to 18 megawatts with their wind turbines, but they're scaling back. So they say, we believe the future of our offshore wind business will be the 15.5 megawatt turbines, which is still very large. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at. But for them in that instance, it looks like they have, at least for now, hit the limit. 18 is too big. It's a little too difficult. The smaller ones, the 13 megawatt turbines are what's operating off of the Massachusetts coast, which we've talked about before. Those are that's an 800 megawatt, the Vineyard Wind Project. Those are using the 13 megawatt turbines. So that one's already out there. So
16,000 homes that one of those 13 megawatt suckers can power in Europe.
So absolutely.
And maybe 1,000 in the United States.
To sneeze at. But so 18 megawatts might be a little big. 15.5 is what they're going to focus on. Then you just have to make more of them, which, seems okay.
Yeah, but it costs money to install offshore. Offshore is more expensive than onshore. And
Yeah, I guess that's the idea. When the installation cost is high, the bigger you can make the wind turbine, and it's going to be out there for possibly decades, that's a cost savings there.
right. And I think 25 years, is it 25 years or 20 years? That's the life of a wind turbine before you have to replace it. But then maybe the structure is would last longer. I don't know, or at least the base of it or something. But yeah, I guess another thing is if they're smaller, you don't have to put them as far out to be not an eyesore to people. That's sort of an advantage. But yeah, I mean, the latest technology is going to be the most expensive and the most difficult to deploy. So if you have lots of experience with the not so latest technology, then maybe you can do that. That's the best business case. I wanted to talk a little bit about data center use again, because I have some numbers here. Since 2010, the number of internet users worldwide has more than doubled. You might have thought, as a North American, everybody's on the internet in 2010. Well, they're not. That mostly went up, I think, because people went directly from not having the internet to having the internet on smartphones, where they could just build up a tower and not put out infrastructure in some countries. Global internet traffic has expanded 25-fold since 2010. All that HD and 4K Netflix material going through the net. Rapid improvements in energy efficiency have helped moderate growth in energy demand from data centers and data transmission networks, but it's still 1 to 1.5% of the global electricity use, and it's, as we said before, it's slated to expand dramatically. So that could be a good chunk of our, maybe 5% or more at some point by 2030. Despite strong gains in efficiency, the rapid growth in workloads handled by large data centers has resulted in substantial increase in energy use in this segment over the past several years, growing 20 to 40% annually. So this is a big deal. Combined electricity used by Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta more than doubled between 2017 and 2021, rising to around 72 terawatt hours in 2021. This is excluding crypto, by the way. So the overall data center energy use appears likely to continue growing moderately over the next few years, but longer-term trends are highly uncertain as we get into AI. And yeah, some of the stuff, just training an AI bot for ChatGPT could power 1,000 U.S. homes. That's just training the algorithm for one computer system, basically.
Yeah.
1,000 U.S. homes. It's massive. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, just the power to do the, when we clone the Pope's voice here on the show, where we're probably using tens of thousands of megawatts.
Well, you and I are both powered by solar, and
yeah.
I don't know, it snowed. I don't know if I'm getting solar or not today, but I might be because it was so windy. I guess that brings us to the lightning round. It's time for the lightning round.
The lightning round is a fast-paced look at the latest headlines in climate, clean energy, and transportation.
Here we go. The Arizona Corporation Commission has approved a request from utility APS to raise rates and add a punitive charge to rooftop solar customers. Residential customers should expect to see bills increase by $10 to $12 per month, while customers with a rooftop can expect their bills to increase by as much as $15 per month. Solar customers are already paying about $80 per month on average just to be connected to the damn grid, Brian. $80 a month.
That's a lot.
At that point, you go buy a battery and say, ta-ta, grid, we don't need you, especially if you're in Arizona, where it's sunny and good solar there. Might be worth considering. Fox Business says climate change explodes the cost of home insurance. We don't often quote Fox News on the show here, but here we go. Florida is most expensive at nearly $10,000. Oklahoma, Texas are other states that have 3 times higher than the national average insurance because of climate change. And surging home insurance costs could force families to leave 10 states in the future. California launches a plan to add 56 gigawatts of solar, wind, and battery storage to slash grid emissions. That means replacing burning gas. The plan cuts gas generation by 71% by 2035 and 90% by 2039. And the grid emissions fall to just 25 megatons by 2035. There's a study by the Pembina Institute in Alberta, Canada. It says that conventional oil and gas, which is allowed on all classes of agricultural land, by the way, is 125 times more land intensive than wind and solar development. And yet, my friend, Alberta is now at the 7-month point of their embargo on wind and solar development because they needed to study it. This right-wing idiot government. There's right-wing governments and then there's right-wing idiot governments. Their oil-rich provinces decided that they didn't like the competition from clean stuff, so they wanted to put a pause on it. And the industry there was exploding. It's got the most in Canada with stuff on the books that's coming is incredible. And they put a pause on it. So this week, hopefully by next show, we'll have some of the restrictions that those wise people are going to put on solar. And it's frustrating. It's time for a CS Fast Fact. Amazon bought more solar and wind power in 2023 than Meta, plastics giant Lidl Basel, and Google combined. That's from Bloomberg. So
Yeah. And I believe Amazon buys some clean energy in Alberta.
that they do. They've got a giant solar farm there. The Rideau Canal by Canada's capital city, Ottawa, has closed after a 10-day season of ice skating. It used to be a popular place for people to go ice skating. It looked really fun on the video and the news when you see it open every year. And it's the shortest on record, except for last year, Brian, which had a 0-day season. And the forecast on Tuesday of this week was set to be 16 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, I've been to Ottawa. I've skated on the canal. It's fantastic. There are people in Ottawa that commute to work when it's actually frozen.
Really?
They can commute to work on skates.
That's so Canadian.
It's so great. You know, the canal goes right through the city, and it's super fun. Here in our own city, we have a lake, a kind of a man-made lake in the middle of our city, and there's an ice rink on that every year, and that one closed way early. It had a way shorter season this year, and we're in the midst of the prairies where, you know, it really should be frozen for 5 months of the year, and that was definitely not the case.
There's a story on Reddit that has been picked up by the clean energy blogs. A Dodge Ram, a normal Dodge Ram pickup truck, gasoline or diesel, was destroyed after running into the back of a Cybertruck. The Cybertruck had little damage. So that's good news for some Cybertruck owners, bad news for society, perhaps? I don't know.
Yeah, perhaps.
He still has to get a little bit of it fixed. But, you know, there's also the story going around that the Cybertruck is not certified for off-road use, that it's you void the warranty if you use it off-road. That's got to change, Brian. That has got to change, because it's going to be a little child vehicle, not the manly vehicle that it pretends to be if you can't take it off-roading.
I think they're still working on some of their software, like the maybe some of the off-road software is not fixed yet.
Well, let's hope so. We'll keep you updated. Thanks to dropping battery costs, the average new EV with 300 miles of range, that's about 500 kilometers, or is it? Alexa, what's 300 miles in kilometers?
300 miles is about 480 kilometers.
Oh, it's not even 500. It's 480. Okay. That's, kind of, it's got to be the same cost as the equivalent gas car by 2028 to 2029. That's a study that was written about in Inside EVs, if you want to read more about that.
And if you take maintenance and fuel costs into account, like all those ridiculous oil changes we were talking about sooner, electric cars are already cheaper, but the sticker price really has to match or be lower for mass adoption.
Swapping out beef for a different protein, even for just one meal a day, can cut the emissions footprint of a person's daily diet by as much as half. That story is in Bloomberg. California, all solar, including grid scale and rooftop PV systems, as well as concentrated solar. That's the one where they have mirrors and heat this fluid up on a tower. Accounted for 28% of the state's electrical output in the 12-month period that ended in September of last year. So they have stats for that, and it's almost a third just from solar, And as I said, rooftop, solar farms, as well as concentrated. There's not a lot of concentrated, but there's some. And it's kind of interesting, although it doesn't work in all places. To simulate that V8 feeling, Dodge is engineering a active vibration enhancement system into its upcoming electric muscle car.
That sounds like an adult novelty toy.
It does. It does. They probably went to the vibrator industry to get some advice because it's stupid, or the home theater industry where seats vibrate. Come on. Noise is one thing. This has gone way too far. If there's a vibration in my car, I think, oh, shoot, something's wrong. I don't want a vibration in my car. It's the last thing I want. 54% of Portugal's electricity is now generated by renewable electricity. That's with no nuclear and no coal. Wind generated 5% of Greece's electricity in 2011, and solar was 1%. But by January 2024, wind generated 34% of Greece's electricity, and solar was 12%.
Wow.
Shows you what can happen in a fairly short time. A survey
5% to 34.
A survey conducted by Dutch researchers has compared the visual impact of overhead and vertical agrivoltaics farms on nearby residents. So you have vertical and you have the more traditional on a rack but raised up so that cows and sheep and whatever and crops can grow underneath of it. And guess what? They preferred the vertical. They did an extensive survey of people who actually drove by two different farms, and people prefer vertical for
we've talked about vertical mounting of solar panels on the show recently, and that could be a much, much bigger thing in the future.
And finally this week, Texas will add more battery storage in 2024 than the U.S. added in all of 2023. The Lone Star State will double in 1 year the amount of energy storage it has, and it has more than most people. California will add another 5.2 gigawatts. Think of a gigawatt as the output of a nuclear reactor. So this is a lot for a battery to do. The U.S. will add 14.3 gigawatts this year in total, but Texas will have 12 gigawatts of 2 to 4 hour storage by the end of 2024. So that's often used for extending the day that solar produces power for the grid and extends it into the high demand in the supper time and evening. And, that's pretty good. So that's 12 gigawatts of storage for 2 to 4 hours for a grid that is only 85 gigawatts. That's a high proportion, Brian, and that is very undoubtedly disruptive.
And we know from past problems that they've had in Texas that they have terrible blackout problems there, partly because they're not interconnected with the rest of the grids in the U.S. They don't share as much electricity with other places. So all of these batteries are going to fix any of those problems that they have. Okay, that is it. That is our show for this week. If you want to contact us, we are cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. Around social media, you can find us as Clean Energy Pod.
And you can find a video of our show on TikTok and YouTube, including special content not featured on the podcast. You can also donate to the show. We have a guy who's donated on a regular month-to-month basis, and I keep getting emails that his payment didn't go through. I forget his name. But I'm assuming he's getting these emails too, and I'm worried that he's dead. I'm worried that one of our listeners is dead. So if you're not dead and you don't want to continue, please turn that off or continue giving us a few bucks a month every year. Yeah, so the information's in your show notes. We appreciate everything you do for us. Have a look at the Clean Energy store. There's merchandise there. People buy stuff, hats, t-shirts of our show. Wear it proudly. If you're new to the show, we always ask, remember to subscribe to our show on your podcast app, because that way you get the new episodes that we do every week here delivered to you right in the morning, usually on Wednesdays. So see you next week.
See you next week.